The Cold War was the open yet restricted rivalry that developed after World War II between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. The Cold War was waged on political, economic, and propaganda fronts and had only limited recourse to weapons. It all started with the surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945 near the close of World War II. The uneasy wartime alliance between the United States and Great Britain on one hand and the Soviet Union on the other began to unravel. By 1948, the Soviets had installed left-wing governments in the countries of Eastern Europe that had been liberated by the Red Army. The Americans and the British feared the permanent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and the threat of Soviet-influenced communist parties coming to power in the democracies of Western Europe. The Soviets, on the other hand, were determined to maintain control of Eastern Europe in order to safeguard against any possible renewed threat from Germany, and they were intent on spreading communism worldwide, largely for ideological reasons. As a result of the Soviet actions, in 1949 the United States and its European allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a unified military command to resist the Soviet presence. In Europe, 1949 was also the year when the Soviets exploded their first atomic warhead, thus ending the American monopoly of the atomic bomb. Throughout the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union avoided direct military confrontation in Europe and engaged in actual combat operations only to keep allies from defecting to the other side or to overthrow them after they had done so. Thus, the Soviet Union sent troops to preserve communist rule in East Germany in 1953, Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Afghanistan in 1979. For its part, the United States helped overthrow a left-wing government in Guatemala in 1954, supported an unsuccessful invasion of Cuba in 1961, invaded the Dominican Republic in 1965 and Grenada in 1983, and from 1964 to 1975 undertook a long and unsuccessful effort to prevent communist North Vietnam from bringing South Vietnam under its rule. The war was waged in space as well. More accurately, it was a race, the space race. This is where the US and the Soviets had an intense rivalry about space and who can get the farthest first. Space exploration served as another dramatic arena for Cold War competition. On October 4, 1957, a Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile launched Sputnik, which is Russian for traveler, the world's first artificial satellite and the first man-made object to be placed into the Earth's orbit. Sputnik's launch came as a surprise, and not a pleasant one, to most Americans. In the United States, space was seen as the next frontier, a logical extension of the grand American tradition of exploration, and it was crucial not to lose too much ground to the Soviets. Following this demonstration of overwhelming power, in 1958 the US launched its own satellite, Explorer 1, designed by the US Army under the direction of rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. That same year, President Dwight Eisenhower signed a public order creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, a federal agency dedicated to space exploration. The Cold War was a game of information. Whichever country knew the most would win this so-called war. This stalemate between the two countries brought about a new doctrine into play. The Mutual Assured Destruction, aka MAD doctrine, which assumed that each side had enough nuclear weaponry to destroy the other side, and that either side, if attacked for any reason by the other, would retaliate without fail with equal or greater force. The expected result is an immediate, irreversible escalation of hostilities resulting in both combatants' mutual, total, and assured destruction.
The doctrine further assumes that neither side will dare to launch a first strike because the other side would launch on warning, also called the fail deadly, or with surviving forces a second strike, resulting in unacceptable losses for both parties. The payoff of the MAD doctrine was and still is expected to be a tense but stable global peace. The war reached its peak with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis was due to the US's failed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro of Cuba during the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. President Kennedy initiated Operation Mongoose, which was designed to incite dissident Cubans against Castro. As a result, Cuba, who was an important ally for the Soviet Union, started receiving Soviet military arms shipments to Cuba primarily for defense. On October 14, 1962, a U.S. U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba photographed the first direct evidence of Soviet medium-range nuclear missiles. These missiles clearly constituted an offensive weapon buildup in Cuba, and U.S. quickly felt its security was threatened. After a series of meetings and analysis of the photographs of the missiles, Executive Committee of the National Security Council received the missile could be in full operation in 4 days. Consequently, the U.S. put quarantine on Cuba in order to prevent further shipment of missiles. In other words, a block not allowing any ships into Cuban waters. While having series of discussion with parties and security advisors, Kennedy sent a letter to Soviet ambassador addressing the issue, but the Soviet Union insisted that the missiles were for defense purposes only. The political tension grew stronger among the two countries. The U.S. looked for other options and began to work on a deal offering them missile trade if the Soviets pulled their missiles from Cuba. The U.S. would do the same to theirs in Turkey. However, the U.S. was convinced the only solution was to invade Cuba and were fully prepared to do so. This led to Khrushchev sending a letter to U.S. proposing they would remove their missiles in Cuba if U.S. agreed not to invade Cuba. Khrushchev sent another message indicating that any proposed deal must include the removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Reluctantly, the U.S. secretly agreed to remove their Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but this couldn't be part of any public resolution of the crisis. The crisis was over, and U.S. quarantine continued until Soviets agreed to remove its 28 bombers from Cuba on November 1962. It was only then the U.S. quarantine ended. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a single event that characterized Cold War. The U.S. and Soviet Union almost went to nuclear war. The political intensity of the two countries reached its climax during the crisis. In order not to happen again, the US and Soviet established a direct telephone link between them called Hotline. After the crisis, they both also reconsidered their nuclear arms race. The war ended in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union.